Hey there, it's Kona Gallagher, host of And Then They Were Gone and Day by Day True Crime Stories, and I am here to bring you an amazing opportunity to win some incredible prizes, all for a good cause. Join the Texas Advocacy Project's The Big Game Football Squares raffle on February 9th, 2025, and help support survivors of power-based abuse. For every $100 donation, you secure a square and a chance to win amazing prizes. You can choose from two exciting grids. The Hawaiian Paradise Grid offers a grand prize of a 7-night stay for two at a luxury resort in Oahu or the Big Island. Or play the Beachfront Mexico Grid for a chance to win a 4-night, all-inclusive stay for two at a 5-star Marival luxury resort in Banderas Bay or Nuevo Nayarit, Mexico. Your contributions help survivors understand their rights, navigate the justice system, and secure emergency protective orders. To participate, visit texasadvocacyproject.org and select your grid today. Don't miss out. Tune into the Texas Advocacy Project's Facebook page on February 9th, 2025 during the game for live updates on winners. Prizes are awarded at the end of each quarter with the grand prize at the game's conclusion. So score big for a cause. Visit texasadvocacyproject.org to learn more.
Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasting.
A kidnapping happens in broad daylight in front of thousands of witnesses, but nobody realizes it's a kidnapping. That's what happened when a man abducted family friends, 11-year-old Joane Ratcliffe and 4-year-old Kirste Gordon, from an Australian rules football match on August 25th, 1973. The stands were packed at the Adelaide Oval in Adelaide, Australia, with over 10,000 fans in attendance. Several people present saw a middle-aged man in a wide-brimmed hat take the two girls, but they said nothing, assuming that he was their father. Now, over 50 years have passed, and after decades of investigation and thousands of leads, recent breakthroughs have led to two extremely strong and chillingly similar suspects. Is one of Australia's most infamous unsolved crimes close to a resolution? When a person goes missing, there's a special kind of pain in the not knowing. I want to tell you the stories of those who never came home. Today, I want to tell you the story of Joane Ratcliffe and Kirste Gordon. I'm Kona Gallagher.
And I'm Ethan Flick.
And this is And Then They Were Gone. Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back.
Thank you for joining us once again. I'm Kona.
And I'm Ethan.
And we're the husband and wife team behind this podcast. Each week, I tell you the story of an unsolved missing persons case. Ethan doesn't know anything about the case going into the episode, and he's here to provide his reactions and questions in real time, hopefully asking some of the same ones you have at home. Now, this week's case is another listener suggestion, and it's a rare case of a multiple child stranger abduction. The brazenness of this crime has led many to compare it to that of the Beaumont children, which I'm sure you've never heard of.
No, of course not.
So, of course, that was 3 siblings who were abducted from an Australian beach just about 7 years before this case.
Oh.
Some even believe that the Beaumont case and this one may be connected. We haven't done the Beaumont children's case on the show yet, but it's also been requested a couple of times, so I'm sure we'll do an episode on it in the future. I was familiar with that story, but I had never heard about Joane and Kirste, so I really kind of wanted to look into this one first. And it's an absolutely devastating story, of course, but not one without hope of a resolution. Before we get started, though, we've had a new member join us over on Patreon, so we want to give a shout out to Ainsley. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you so much.
Remember, if you join us there on any level, starting at just $2 a month, you can get these episodes early and ad-free and also get a free copy of the ebook that I wrote. One more thing that I want to mention before we get started is over the past couple weeks, you may have heard another ad in the show for something called Touchdown for a Cause. Touchdown for a Cause is the Texas Advocacy Project's Super Bowl football squares raffle that's taking place on Super Bowl Sunday on February 9th, 2025. And the money raised is going to help support survivors of power-based abuse. For every $100 donation, you get a square and a chance to win amazing prizes, including 2 grand prizes. So one is a 7-night stay for 2 at a luxury resort in Hawaii. And the other one is a 4-night all-inclusive stay for 2 in Mexico.
Have we signed up for this?
Yes, we definitely still need to buy a square. But I've been playing the promo for this for a couple weeks. And the reason that we got involved in this is because my sister, Heather Bellino, is actually the CEO of Texas Advocacy Project. They're based in Austin and they do a lot of amazing work. So check them out. And we do have the link in order for you to enter the football square raffle in the show notes of this episode. This is coming out a few days before the Super Bowl, so you still have a little bit of time to enter. Oh, and I did hear from Heather that a couple of people who have entered said that they found it from the podcast.
Nice.
So if you're listening right now, thank you so much. She was so excited, and it truly, truly means a lot to us. All right, now with all that out of the way, let's get into the story of Joane Ratcliffe and Kirste Gordon. Joane Ratcliffe was born on March 24th, 1962, to Les and Kathleen Ratcliffe. She had one older brother, David. Now, unfortunately, due to the nature of media in the 70s and the shocking nature of the crime, I don't know a whole lot about either girl prior to their disappearance. The stories pretty much focus on the search for them. But I do know that Joane loved animals and had a kind and nurturing nature. Kirste Gordon was only 4 when she was abducted, and she was born on November 29th, 1968, to Greg and Christine Gordon. She was the oldest of 2 girls. Kirste is said to have had a lively, inquisitive, and happy nature. She loved to sing and as a toddler would regale people on buses with her repertoire of nursery rhymes. On August 25th, 1973, Kirste's parents were out of town with Kirste's little sister, but Kirste stayed behind with her maternal grandmother. Both the Ratcliffes and the Gordons had football season passes and always sat next to each other at Adelaide Oval. That day, Kirste and her grandmother sat with Joane, her parents, and the Ratcliffe's family friend, a guy named Frank. Joane was 7 years older than Kirste, and she loved playing big sister to the younger girl while they attended these games. She would fuss over her and would help out the adults, just like a little mom. Early in the game, Joane needed to go to the bathroom, so Kirste's grandmother asked her to take Kirste with her. Joane agreed, and the two made it back to their seats a few minutes later. So later, around 3:45 p.m., when the girls needed to go to the bathroom again, no one was concerned. They just let them. It was fine. Except this time, they didn't come back. Now, what happens next is absolutely devastating because had this gone slightly differently, it's very possible that these 2 girls could have been saved. After about 15 minutes go by and the girls haven't returned, they're about 3/4 through the game at this point. Joanne's mother, Kathleen, went to go look for them. And, I don't think she was super concerned by this point, right? Because a lot can happen when you're in.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one of the kids had diarrhea or something.
Exactly.
Or, who knows?
Yeah, there's always bathroom issues, I feel like. And again, Kirste was 4, so it's not like she had been potty trained forever.
Right.
There could have been a long line, whatever. Kathleen went to the ladies' room that they would have used, but didn't see any sign of the girls. So then she began to frantically search for them, but nothing. They weren't anywhere between their seats and the restroom. So Kathleen went back to the seats and let the other adults know what was going on. They all got up and started to search for the girls, but interestingly, and this didn't come out till years later, according to both Kathleen and Kirste's grandmother, Frank, the family friend, didn't join in on the search.
Interesting.
Yeah. Kirste's grandmother said, quote, "The other man stayed in his seat," end quote.
It's an odd choice.
So when the families couldn't find the girls, after they were all looking, Kathleen went to try to get an announcement made over the PA system, but the employees refused.
What?
Yeah, they said that it would disrupt the game.
You've got 2 missing kids.
Yeah, but, okay, in their defense, kids probably wander off a lot in situations like that and are later found, playing under the stands or whatever. Still indeed, because that proved to be key in this case. She couldn't get an announcement made. They continued to look, but didn't find them. Finally, around 5 p.m. after the match was over, Kathleen was able to get them to make the announcement. But by that time, Joanne and Kirste were long gone. After police were called and the investigation began, it quickly became apparent that many people witnessed the abduction, but they just didn't realize what they were seeing.
Right.
Instead, what most of them thought they saw was a father taking his 2 unruly children out of the stadium.
Yep.
Because the staff refused to make an announcement about the missing girls when Kathleen initially asked, fans had no idea that they should have been keeping a lookout or that what they had actually seen was an abduction.
Right. So, I mean, I'm assuming you're going to get into the specifics of the witness account, but you said unruly kids, so I guess they were
fighting.
Resisting.
Yes.
And nobody thought anything of it because, on a normal day, you would just think, okay, well, these kids,
they don't want to
reach their
leave.
limit, or, we're just having meltdowns, and that's their
Exactly.
parent taking them out of the stadium.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so you can really understand from the witness's perspective, why they didn't do anything at the time. But if that announcement had been made, everything could have been different.
Wow. All because they didn't want to disrupt the game.
Thankfully, though, because there were so many witnesses and, the act itself at least did stand out, they were able to get a detailed sketch of the suspect. He was a tall, thin, middle-aged white man wearing a distinctive wide-brimmed hat. Now, the type of hat he was wearing was not common in Australia at the time, so it stood out to people.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what type of wide-brim hat it was.
Well, it was like a brown leather, not fedora, but, along those lines.
So like an Indiana Jones hat?
Kind of, but not quite. One of the key witnesses was a 13-year-old boy named Tony Kilmartin. He and his brother were at the game selling lollies and ice creams. He had noticed Joanne and Kirste a few times throughout the day, and apparently they'd even bought ice cream from him earlier. So he was 13, Joanne was 11. He apparently kind of thought Joanne was cute. And so he was keeping an eye, noticing her,
Yeah.
So that actually made him a really good witness because he was paying attention and had interacted with them prior to their disappearance.
Mm-hmm.
Close to the end of the game, he heard a commotion. He was interviewed by police immediately, but Tony just spoke publicly for the first time in 2023 about this. And he said in that interview, quote, "I saw one go under the arm and the other one just pulling on him, screaming the words, 'No,' and 'let her go.' I just watched them go towards the gate, and that was the last I'd seen," end quote. And like many others that day, he didn't intervene, 1, because he was 13, and 2, because he believed that the man was the girl's father. As soon as the story of Joanne and Kirste's abductions hit the news, so did the comparisons to that of the Beaumont children. In fact, the cover story of the next day's edition of the Sunday Mail had the headline, quote, "Girls 411 vanish, big hunt," end quote. And the subheadline was, quote, "We never forget Beaumonts." As I mentioned earlier, the Beaumont children were 3 siblings who had been abducted from Glenelg Beach near Adelaide back in 1966. Their case is still unsolved to this day, even though there were several suspects. At least 2 of them, Bevan Spencer Von Enum and Derek Percy, were looked at in this case as well, but no solid connections could be made. The closest they came with those 2 and connecting either of them to this case was that Frank, the family friend who accompanied the Ratcliffes to the match at Adelaide Oval that day, ended up selling his home in the late 70s, so several years after this. to Bevan Spencer von Einam's mother.
Interesting.
Now, this is likely just a weird coincidence, but Joane Ratcliffe's younger sister, Susie Wilkinson, brought it up on the 40th anniversary of the abduction. And she did this to highlight the gaps in the police investigation. So this guy, Frank, apparently left his seat for around 30 minutes prior to the girls' disappearance. And as I mentioned earlier, he allegedly did not help search for them. And, this is not great, but according to Susie, she's not even sure if police formally questioned him or analyzed his movements that day.
Why? Why wouldn't they?
I have no idea. And, she's quick to point out that they're not necessarily accusing him of anything.
No, but there's a lot of A, odd behavior the day of.
Yeah.
And B, later, there's a connection between him and a suspect in another missing person's case.
Yeah, and that suspect was looked at this case,
right.
In this case as well. Yeah, so it is weird. And that's her thing. She's like, listen, I don't know if this dude had anything to do with it. And truthfully, spoiler alert, she doesn't really think that he did. But it just, again, it just highlights the gaps in this investigation.
Right. It doesn't seem like it was a very thorough investigation.
Right. And, he had been with Joanne and Kirste all day and, likely had seen things that maybe from a different perspective as other people who were there. You know what I mean? Like
right.
Even if he's not involved, he could very well have had valuable information. It's weird because, there are a lot of gaps in the investigation, but they really put a lot of manpower behind it initially. It was extremely high profile. This wasn't a situation where the police were like, oh, no, I'm sure they'll come back. Like, they knew this was a stranger abduction right away.
Well, was it though?
What I will say is that the witnesses, not only reported seeing the man carry the girls out of the stadium, but another witness later said that they saw them like on a bridge. There was another witness that said that he actually saw the man put the two girls into a van.
Yeah, no, I'm not doubting that man didn't know those kids. What I'm saying is, was it actually a stranger abduction in the sense of like a complete unknown? It seems odd to me that this person was at a football game and got lucky spotting these two kids that happened to be away from their parents, and he just took a chance, grabbed them, and left. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So we'll get into that a little bit more when we're talking about suspects.
Okay.
So as extensive as the investigation was, and as high profile as the case remains to be, as time passed, it became clear that there were definitely avenues that had not been fully explored.
Right. And that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
Like, it seems to me that the cops got it in their head also. Stranger abduction, no connection to these kids. Let's go with that theory and put all of our efforts into whatever else, finding them, doing whatever, which is great, but not doing extensive interviews of anybody that was around the kids.
Right. Yeah. If they didn't interview Frank, that's obviously a huge missed opportunity.
Right.
Now, I mentioned Joanne's sister, Susie. She comes up a lot in the news stories about this case that are from the last decade or so, because Susie's the one who's really driving the investigation from her family's side and working tirelessly to keep the case fresh in people's minds. And she has taken on this quest despite never having met her sister Joanne or Kirste. After Joanne's abduction, the Ratcliffes were, of course, devastated. And apparently, and this seems like a very 1973 thing, I don't think this would happen now, a doctor suggested that they have another child in order to help with their grief.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So Susie was born 14 months after Joanne's abduction.
Jesus.
Even though she never knew her big sister, she says that her parents always talked about her and answered any questions that she had. She said that when she was a little girl, she would look at a photo of Joanne on the mantle and said she wanted her to come back so that they could play together. As time went on, other suspects emerged, and two suspects in particular had some shocking similarities. Arthur Stanley Brown was already on the police's radar when the Beaumont children disappeared. So naturally, when a similar crime occurred, he was at the top of their list. Brown looks similar to the suspect sketches in both cases and was accused by family members of being a pedophile. He was also the main suspect in the 1970 rape and murder of two sisters, Suzanne Deborah McKay and Judith Elizabeth McKay. They were only 5 and 7 years old. Unfortunately, the investigation into the sisters' murders was bungled, and Brown wasn't actually charged with those crimes until 1998.
Wow.
Yeah, nearly 30 years afterwards. The arrest got a lot of media attention, and that's when a new witness in the Adelaide Oval abduction came forward. Sue Laurie was 14 at the time of the abduction, and she was there that day. She told under investigation, quote, "I saw a man coming at a rapid pace towards us on the gravel path carrying a young child. Following behind, running to keep up to him, was a girl, and she was absolutely punching this man as hard as she could in the back and saying, 'Put her down, put her down.' And she was so upset." End quote. But it wasn't until 1998 that she says she saw that man again. When Arthur Stanley Brown popped up on her TV, she says that she knew that was the man who had been seen taking Joanne and Kirste nearly 30 years prior. She told reporters, quote, "Years later, when I saw his photo, I instantly said, 'That's the man. That's the face.'" End quote. That trial that happened for the sisters ended up in a hung jury, and by that time, Brown was suffering from dementia, so they just didn't try him again. So he died a free man.
Wow.
Yeah. Even more compelling, in 2023, Under Investigation teamed up with NEC Australia, a leading global software technology company, to use their facial identification software in this case. They used the composite sketch created by witnesses back in 1973 and put it in with 15,000 random headshots of men, along with photos with some of the suspects in this case, including Brown. Using just the sketch, the software ranked the images by how likely they were to match the sketch. And that algorithm ranked photos of Brown in positions 1, 3, and 4.
So pretty likely it was him.
Yeah, so out of 15,000 photos, that software said that, 3 of the top 4 matches were Brown.
Interesting. Wonder how that would hold up in court.
They didn't say who number 2 was, but I think it was just a random person. I don't think it was one of the other suspects. And so, a lot of this fits. His age is right, his physical appearance is right, and the MO. It's widely believed that he was guilty of those 1970 murders. This is just 3 years later. And it's a similar MO. He grabbed 2 girls at the same time. It's also been said by investigators that he actually was running a pedophile ring. But there's one major issue. Other witnesses have identified a completely different person, but one with a similar name as the abductor, Stanley Arthur Hart.
Okay.
In a bizarre twist, 2 men who are both known pedophiles who look similar and have similar names, Arthur Stanley Brown and Stanley Arthur Hart, have been accused of abducting Joanne and Kirste. So who is Stanley Arthur Hart, and how did he become a suspect in this case? Hart was another pedophile who was also known to wear hats similar to the one witnesses reported. What's more is he lived nearby in Adelaide, or a property connected to him was nearby in Adelaide. I can't remember if it was his mother's house or something like that. But he was also a huge North Adelaide fan, and that's one of the teams that was playing that day, and he rarely missed a match. It should also be noted that this house that was in Adelaide, and this is getting back to what you were saying about it not quite being a stranger abduction, that how could somebody be so lucky, to come across these 2 girls? That house was near the Gordons' home. So there's a very strong possibility that he could have seen Kirste Gordon prior to that day, had known about her, known she was going to be at the match.
And knew what her parents looked like.
Yep.
So he could identify the fact that the kids...
No, so it was near her grandmother's house, but her grandmother was who she was with that day.
Okay, so knew what her grandmother looked like and could tell that grandma wasn't around.
Yeah.
So he would have known and yes, maybe he was that lucky, but in recognizing her, looking around for grandma, knows what grandma looks like, can see grandma's not around.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, investigators believe that Kirste was actually the intended victim, but Joanne, being such a protector, wasn't going to allow Kirste to be taken. So she fought the man who had, remember, because the witnesses said that the man had grabbed Kirste and
Right.
Joanne was behind him, like punching him in the back.
Yeah.
She was trying to save her, and it likely cost her her life. So because Hard had connections to Adelaide, he was actually one of the sex offenders who was interviewed in the days after the abduction. As we see in most cases like this, whether it's in Australia, America, wherever, it is generally standard operating procedure for police to interview like known sex offenders in the area, right?
Yeah.
He just happened to be one of those known sex offenders. But apparently nothing really came out of that interview because obviously he wasn't arrested or anything like that. But then in 2009, there was a confession in this case, but it didn't come from Hart or Brown.
Okay.
That year, another pedophile in prison named Mark Trevor Marshall said that on August 25th, 1973, he was about 4 years old, and he was at Adelaide Oval with his grandfather. He wrote in a long, detailed, often rambling letter that he later gave to a counselor that his grandfather was the one responsible for abducting the girls. This letter was initially dismissed as it was 40 pages long and a lot of it made very little sense. But in 2009, the letter ended up on the desk of Brian Littley, who at the time was an investigations editor at the Advertiser. Littley took a look at the letter and recognized Marshall's name as a convicted pedophile, so that kind of made him take interest in it.
Mm-hmm.
As he dug through the 40 pages of the letter, he found specific information about the abduction, including a claim that Marshall himself was in the van where his grandfather put the girls. And remember, witnesses had mentioned a van. He also spoke about a property in Yatina, about 250 kilometers from Adelaide, where his grandfather took the two girls. It was at this property that he assaulted and murdered them. The letter also talked about wells and barrels on that property. As Littley read this letter, he realized who Marshall's grandfather was. Stanley Arthur Hart.
Oh, come on. Really?
Yep.
Jesus.
Once he put the pieces together, Littley gave the letter to South Australian police and asked if they had investigated it. But police dismissed the letter as, quote, a fantasy.
But his grandfather was one of the prime suspects.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
By this time, Joanne's sister Susie was an adult and she was at the forefront of solving Joanne and Kirste's case. She got a hold of this letter. So I think Brian gave it to her and was like, hey, this is...
You got to read this.
Yeah, exactly. And she said in interviews, now the full letter has never been released, but she has said in interviews that there were details in that just seemed too...
specific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not like things that, he just would have known from the news or things like that. She said that it truly does feel like it was written by somebody who was there or had a lot of knowledge about the case. And again, he was 4, so he obviously wasn't the perpetrator.
Right.
So when she got a hold of this letter, she was able to get a private investigator to search the Yatina property. Now, in the letter, Marshall had even drawn a map to the barrels, which the investigator followed. Now, he found the barrels and inside them found, quote, an apron, a hat, part of a girl's shoe, and bones, end quote. But we don't know if they were human bones. These initial findings in 2009, like the bones especially, it's been unclear from the articles that I've read what actually happened to those.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a private investigator.
Yeah.
But, so did the police ever get involved in this?
It's been confusing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this property too, because they go back. So it's a little confusing as to when the police were there versus when private investigators were there, because I think both have gone back multiple times.
Okay, but
so
not necessarily together?
I don't think ever together. So that's the thing. So I'm a little unclear about the order. So, okay, so this is what the investigators said they found in 2009. one of the items found in the barrel was an apron. And Marshall's letter had described Hart, who was a former butcher, wearing an apron. So in 2015, Susie went to see the Yatina property for herself. She later described it saying, quote, "There was a tunnel that led to the dam, and on the tunnel, there were big metal gates which had not been disturbed. They, the investigators, and meaning like the private investigators, had to break open the gates, and the water was high, so one of the investigators went in there and he found 2 barrels. They pulled them both out, and there was a honeycomb substance inside which had a reddish color to it." End quote. This search she's talking about, I do know, happened after the police had been there, because the police went and she just didn't think they had gone far enough or to the right places. And so like this whole thing where they found the barrels had clearly not been investigated by police.
Yeah.
So this red substance in there, they're of course concerned is blood. So they immediately had it tested. Susie said, quote, "It was independently tested with a vet who had no knowledge of the history / where it had come from, and it came back positive for blood." End quote. So Susie and the investigators wanted to do the right thing, so they immediately handed everything over to the police. The investigator went in with an attorney and kept the evidence receipts as proof. The investigator continued to check in with police about the evidence, but according to him, was eventually told that it had been lost.
What?
That's what he was told. So then he turned in a second sample from the barrel, because they didn't give them like all of the blood,
Yeah.
But then claims he received a letter from the attorney general ordering him not to pursue the case any further.
Whoa.
And I know that sounds like a cover-up or something, but I think it was mainly like they just thought this guy was a nuisance and wasn't uncovering anything of evidence and just wanted him to like leave the case alone. Which isn't great.
No.
I mean, it's not, I'm not saying that like that's justified. I just want to make it clear that I don't think there's some like government cover-up of this happening.
No, but it certainly doesn't seem like they want to pursue anything in this case.
Yeah, no, and I was actually really surprised, and we'll get into a few more things here in a second about how much is seemingly not being investigated currently. So back in the intro, I said that this 50-year-old cold case could be close to a resolution, and that's because they have uncovered like crazy evidence like this. And so in addition to all of that, they also found a hat in the Yatina home that matches witness descriptions of the hat worn by the abductor. The problem is, at least as of January 2025, the police don't seem interested in it.
Do you think that's because it's such an old case?
No, because the police are constantly going on, because it was just the 50th anniversary recently, right? And so the police are like, oh, this is so important to us. We want to solve this. Like, please give us tips, whatever. And then they're giving them like the hat, and the police dismissed it. Brian Whittley, that ex-reporter who originally got the letter, has remained involved in this case. On January 7th, 2025, he made a post on the missing Joane Ratcliffe Facebook page that read in part, quote, "That's the hat. Anthony Kilmartin," and remember, Anthony Kilmartin is the little boy who was selling the ice cream.
Yeah.
Anthony Kilmartin is adamant that the hat I handed over to SAPOL, so South Australian Police, SAPOL Major Crime in the Victor Harbour Police Station in August 2023, a week before the 50th anniversary of the abduction of Joanne and Kirste from Adelaide Oval, is the hat worn by the abductor who he saw at close range. Police have at least 3 times suggested they have little to no interest in the hat within a couple of months of having handed it to them, suggesting that their examination of the hat had it made at a time after 1973. The research done by our very efficient, diligent team meant I could confidently go back to SAPOL to tell them they were wrong. They asked for our research, and I did provide references, but not the findings. They have since said a couple of times they are not particularly interested in the hat, that it is in their mind not significant. But multiple requests for SAPOL to return the hat, my/our property, have been rejected, including 2 months ago when the lead detective said it still needed to be examined, but she could not put a time frame on that, nor did she know by who it would be examined. I'm still waiting to hear back from them after again asking today for the hat to be returned. And then he posted photos of the hat. There are actually 2 hats that they found. And he said, check out the hat and its intricacies here. The slouch hat, also Stan Hart's, was found in the Yatina shack in 2009 also. It is missing the leather band, which we consider matches the additional leather trim hand-stitched to the Stetson, making the Stetson a one-of-a-kind. So the Stetson is the hat that they think he was wearing that day. And according to their research, it was made in the 50s, not after 1973.
Mm-hmm.
And they believe that he had taken the band from the second hat and had it stitched onto the Stetson.
Interesting.
So they gave the hat to the police. They're like, no, this was made after the 70s. They said, no, it's not. The police said, oh, well, all right. and still won't give it back.
Yeah, because it has to be examined.
Yeah.
Don't know by who.
No,
or
when.
why. Or when.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And again, police have been constantly making statements about how much they want this case solved. And there's even a $1 million reward that they had put up. According to the missing Joane Ratcliffe Facebook page, Susie and everybody else, investigating this case from a civilian standpoint, keep on running into roadblocks. In 1978, there was a coroner's inquest into this case. Now, the evidence presented obviously didn't lead to arrests, but so much has been discovered in this case since 1978. On November 23rd, 2024, Susie wrote a letter to the Attorney General to request that the inquest be reopened. In January 2025, she heard back, and the answer was no.
What?
The Honorable Kaya Mar wrote in part, quote, having received advice and carefully considered the information raised in your letter, I am not minded to direct the state coroner to reopen the coronial inquest at this time. I understand that you have also written to the state coroner. It remains open to the coroner's court to reopen the inquest at any time under Section 26 of the Coroners Act 2003. As you would be aware, the South Australia Police SAPOL investigation into these disappearances remains open. Any new evidence can also be provided to SAPOL for consideration and investigation. End quote.
So the AG basically just pawned it off on either the coroner or South Pole Police.
Yeah.
Saying, I'm not getting involved in this investigation because those 2 entities can open it up if they want.
Yep.
Or the coroner can open it up if they want, but it's already open on the police side, so let them deal with it.
Yeah, and you can give them the evidence, which they've been doing with...
To no avail.
Yeah. So yeah, as they mentioned in the letter, Susie had written a request to the state coroner at the same time, and she received their response a few days after she had received this one. And while this letter wasn't an agreement to reopen the case, it was at least a more positive response. Gail Torish, a manager at the state coroner's office, responded in part, quote, we wish to advise we have met with SAPOL's major crime today and discussed the 1979 inquest and finding into the disappearance of your sister Joane Ratcliffe and Kirste Gordon. We undertake to review the evidence presented in that inquest and continue to liaise with major crime as appropriate, as they have advised us that it is an open and active investigation. End quote.
Open and active, but they're ignoring
right. So it's not a no.
Presented to them.
Yeah, so it's not a no like she got from the AG, but it's not a yes, we're going to reopen.
Right.
So, I mean, they're like hopeful with it, but again, it's not a yes. Now, in addition to like all of that physical evidence that we've talked about that they want kind of brought into this inquest, there is additional evidence that Susie and her team want to have presented. This is when we get back to Frank, the family friend.
Right. Okay.
Well, according to Brian Littley, Frank is a man named Frank Bone. Now, I mentioned earlier that they weren't sure if he had ever been formally interviewed. Well, there's even more to it than that. Frank Bone's son, Alex Bone, was also there that day.
How old was he?
I'm not exactly sure. I think he's just another kid.
Okay.
But he had never been mentioned in the initial inquest or in any of the media coverage surrounding the case.
Uh-huh.
And Brian apparently only found out he was even there like 10 years ago. So they believe that he could have important information and they want him to testify.
Yeah.
Littley wrote on the Missing Joane Ratcliffe Facebook page, quote, "A person who saw almost every movement of the girls in their final hours before they disappeared was not considered important in the investigation at the time and has had to contact SA police himself in recent times to try to make statements which stand to correct misinformation about the girls' movements on the day. He has been, he says, ignored by SAPOL."
Why? Why? I don't understand. Why? I don't understand why they're not investigating any of this.
I don't know. So he goes on to say his information includes police being restricted in their efforts to search for the girls and the girls being away from the family group for up to 30 minutes before first thought. So he says they could have been missing 30 minutes longer before they thought. This, though, is not considered by the state's top legal advisor enough to trigger a new inquest. End quote. Of course, referring to the Attorney General.
Yeah.
The important thing also to know is that as of right now, 2025, this kid, who's obviously now, an adult, Alex Bone, is the only remaining person alive from that group that day.
So Frank passed?
Yes, Frank passed. Les Ratcliffe, Joanne and Susie's father, passed away in 1981. Their mother, Kathleen, died in 2019. And even Susie's brother, David, passed away in 2020. Everybody who was there that day, including Kirste's grandmother,
Right.
are now gone.
Wow.
So they have one living witness who, again, like they said, had seen all of the girls' movements.
And the police don't want to talk to him.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because, and I do want to make it clear that I've never read anywhere that, like, Frank, for instance, had ever been accused of any crime, right? Being a pedophile, of like being
Sure.
possibly anything, right? But, it is interesting because, all right, so you've got these two suspects, Brown and Hart. They both have ties to Queensland, Australia, as well as Adelaide.
Mm-hmm.
And I said earlier that police believe that Brown was running a pedophile ring. So investigators think that there's a very good chance that they could have known each other.
Yeah.
And that maybe, they are both connected in some way. But it's so weird because, it doesn't seem as though they both necessarily could have been in the stadium that day, right? But all of the witnesses are so confident about who they saw, whether it's the ones who are sure they saw Hart and whether it's the ones who are sure they saw Brown.
Right.
So I don't know. And even though there's like physical evidence tying Hart to the killers, the facial recognition software said that Brown looked more like the sketch.
Yeah.
And it was Brown who had committed, those two murders, though he was not officially found guilty, that were just so similar to this crime.
Didn't you say, though, that Frank Bone sold his house to Brown's grandmother?
No, it was a totally different murderer, pedophile guy who had also been looked at in this case and the Beaumont case.
Oh, okay.
No, totally different third guy.
Off that initial topic, though, it is interesting to note now we know that Frank had his son there.
Yeah.
We don't know his exact age.
No.
But that's probably the reason why he didn't get up and start looking for the girls, because we don't know how old his son was. What if his son was a little kid or, whatever, and he didn't want to scare his son and take him around the park looking for the girls.
That is so interesting. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, that would explain. So now we know that he had his kid there. It's not such odd behavior to not get up and go looking for the girls. Like, if he was just some dude sitting there by himself, like, why the fuck wouldn't you get up and help your friends look for their missing girls?
And that's how every article portrayed it, because the only mention I've ever heard of Alex, the kid, was on Brian Littley's Facebook post from a month ago.
Yeah.
Like, the articles in this case barely even mention Frank. But when they do not mention that he had a son with him. But that makes perfect sense as to why you're right. He wouldn't want to take his kid to like go look for these little girls. And two, why it would also make sense for them to stay there.
Right.
In case the girls came back.
The girls came back, yes.
So yeah, like that does really now feel like a complete red herring.
Yeah. Because nobody mentioned that he had his fucking kid with him. Jesus.
That's insane. And you're right. And Brian literally said that he found out about this 10 years ago, 40 years after the case.
Yeah.
That is wild.
But we're also still left with why the hell are police just ignoring evidence that's being presented to them? Like, it doesn't even seem like they're investigating. Like,
it's so
they
bizarre.
found bones on this property. We don't know if the police took the bones, tried to identify, were they human, were they not?
Because as a former butcher, I mean, they could very well have been animal bones.
Sure. It seems odd to throw them in barrels and bury the barrels, but, whatever. The red substance in the barrels being identified as blood, we don't know.
We don't know if it's human blood necessarily. Right. Could have been animal blood.
I'm sure there's some tests that can be done.
Yeah, for sure.
To determine that, but like, why aren't the police testing it? Why aren't the police going back to that property? And where is... I'm assuming Hart's dead?
Yeah, Hart died too. Yeah. In 1999, I believe.
Ay.
Oh, and the other thing is, so like that property in Yakima, which is, like 3.5 hours away or something like that from Adelaide, the grandson did say that that's where he took them. And again, the physical evidence would point to that. But that may not have been where he took them immediately. So apparently that home that he had in Adelaide, which, again, I think might have been his mother's home or something, it had a bunker.
What?
It had an underground bunker. And nobody realized it until years later.
Wow. So chances are he took them there.
He could have very easily took them there, held them for some amount of time, and then taken them. Yeah.
To his disposal site, essentially.
Right.
Wow. And the police just missed all of this. But for some reason are refusing to investigate it now.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's because the suspects are dead, and they're like,
Who
well, we
cares?
can't. Well, exactly. I mean, Susie certainly doesn't.
Yes. Like, even, look, you're probably not going to get like a 100% for sure this is the guy, because you're not. Like,
no.
He's dead. Most of the evidence at this point is 50 years old, probably gone. But, I mean, investigate it and get to a relatively logical conclusion.
Yeah.
So that there is closure for the families.
Yeah. And,
for whoever's left of the families.
Exactly. And depending on what physical evidence there is left, I mean, DNA testing has advanced to the point where, like, if they can find either of the girls' DNA, even
on
like
that
touch
property,
DNA
yes.
on, anything from that property.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. And that's part of why I really wanted to do this story because, like I said, a lot of this information is from a month before we're recording this, which is not always what you find in a 50-year-old case.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you're listening to this and you're in Australia, especially in the Adelaide area, you can help put pressure on the police, because yes, this story has stayed in the news, but the pressure hasn't necessarily been put on the police because since it is so old, I think a lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of evidence that could be tested. There are avenues that can still be explored. Like, they're not at a dead end by any means.
Right.
And so I think that if, public pressure is placed on them, then it might spur them into either reopening the inquest or doing some testing or whatever it may be. And I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, and if the police are looking at it as we're not going to get an arrest in this case because it's 50 years old and all the suspects are dead, once again, who cares?
Yeah. It's still going to be a huge
closure for the families and the story itself.
Exactly. It'll be a huge win for them
Yes.
to say we solved this 50-year-old case.
Right.
Right. And, listen, I'm not really up to date on like South Adelaide police, but I'm sure they could use some good press because I think any police agency can generally use some good press.
Yeah.
Now, Susie, as I mentioned, has been fighting for years to get closure for Joanne's story. She's the only one from her family who is still alive. Kirste's parents are still alive, but they just kind of don't really talk to the media a whole lot. But Susie has really dedicated herself to this to the point where she started a foundation called Leave a Light On. And she named it after the way her parents used to leave the front porch light on every night so Joanne could find her way home. The Leave a Light On Facebook page is for families of missing people to connect. And a lot of the work that she's done has been through her foundation on this case. The abduction of Joane Ratcliffe and Kirste Gordon will be 52 years old this summer. But like we've said, there is still plenty of evidence that can be examined. All of the suspects, including the two main ones, Brown and Hart, are now dead. So yes, it is unlikely that we would get justice in the form of a trial or a conviction. But that doesn't mean that Susie, the Gordons, and everyone else who's been missing Joanne and Kirste over the years can't get answers. They just need investigators to be willing to dig.
I mean, even more so than just solving this case, if they go out to that property and find,
who knows what else they would find?
Yes, they may find closures or links to various other cases.
Well, the Beaumont children, maybe.
Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah.
Like, they may, if they investigate this and really get into that property and start looking around, they may find answers to a lot more than just this case.
They just need the pressure put on them. Joane Ratcliffe and Kirste Gordon have been missing from Adelaide, Australia since August 25th, 1973. At the time of their disappearance, Kirste was about 3 feet 4 inches tall, with blonde shoulder-length hair, blue eyes, and a fair complexion with faint freckles. She was last seen wearing a white pleated skirt, purple sweater, white tights, and brown lace-up shoes. Kirste also has several distinguishing marks, including a slight scar above the bridge of her nose, and birthmarks at the base of her spine and below her hairline. Joanne was about 4 feet tall with a medium build. Joanne had brown hair and pigtails with brown eyes and a fair complexion. Joanne was wearing a white blouse with mustard-colored tank top, black jeans, white shoes, and white socks. The suspected abductor has been described as a white man, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a stooped appearance. He was wearing a brown hat with a wide brim, a gray checked sports coat, and brown trousers. If you have any information which may assist both families and police to locate Kirste and Joanne, please make contact with Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. You can see all of the sources for this episode along with photos and videos at our website, andthentheywere.gone.com.
And be sure to follow us on social, And Then They Were Gone Pod on Facebook and at ATTWG Pod on Instagram and TikTok. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe and consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It will help new listeners find us. And the more people that listen, the more chances we have of bringing someone home.
And we'll see you here next week for a brand new episode.
See you next week.
And Then They Were Gone is hosted by Kona Gallagher and Ethan Flick. All research, writing, and editing is done by me, Kona Gallagher. Theme music is The Stork by Ketsa. Additional music is provided by Kai Engel. And Then They Were Gone is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!
Hey there, it's Kona Gallagher, host of And Then They Were Gone and Day by Day True Crime Stories. And I am here to bring you an amazing opportunity to win some incredible prizes, all for a good cause. Join the Texas Advocacy Project's The Big Game Football Squares raffle on February 9th, 2025, and help support survivors of power-based abuse. For every $100 donation, you secure a square and a chance to win amazing prizes. You can choose from 2 exciting grids. The Hawaiian Paradise Grid offers a grand prize of a 7-night stay for 2 at a luxury resort in Oahu or the Big Island. Or Play the Beachfront Mexico grid for a chance to win a 4-night, all-inclusive stay for 2 at a 5-star Marival luxury resort in Banderas Bay or Nuevo Nayarit, Mexico. Your contributions help survivors understand their rights, navigate the justice system, and secure emergency protective orders. To participate, visit TexasAdvocacyProject.org and select your grid today. Don't miss out. Tune in to the Texas Advocacy Project's Facebook page on February 9th, 2025, during the game for live updates on winners. Prizes are awarded at the end of each quarter, with the grand prize at the game's conclusion. So score big for a cause. Visit TexasAdvocacyProject.org to learn more.